My pain is self-chosen, at least so the prophet says. A single lyric, whispered like confession, heavy like prophecy. To some, it sounded like a man resigned to fate. To others, it was a battle cry, someone admitting their demons and daring the world to watch him wrestle with them. But to truly understand what Layne Staley meant when he sang those words, you have to go back to where the song came from. You have to look at Mad Season, a band born not from the hunger of ambition, but from the fragile hope of recovery. In 1994, Pearl Jam's Mike McCready checked himself into Hazelden, a treatment facility in Minnesota. At the time, Pearl Jam had exploded into one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. But behind the tours, the fame, and the pressure, McCready was drowning in alcohol and drugs. He knew if he didn't stop, there wouldn't be a future, at least not one he'd want to live. There, in Hazelden, he met bass player John Baker Saunders, a Chicago musician who had toured with the Walkabouts and the Lamont Cranston band. Saunders was older than McCready, a seasoned player with scars from the same battles. The two struck a pact: get clean, stay clean, and once on the other side, make music that wasn't about excess or fame, but about healing. Back in Seattle, McCready called Barrett Martin, the drummer for the Screaming Trees. Martin, already steeped in jazz, rock, and spiritual traditions, was immediately interested. Together, they dreamed of a group that could channel blues, psychedelia, and raw human honesty. But they needed a voice powerful enough to cut through all that weight. So they called Layne Staley. Layne wasn't in a good place. Alice in Chains had reached global fame off the back of Dirt and Jar of Flies. The world knew him as one of the most haunting vocalists of his generation, a man who could howl like a banshee and break your heart in the same breath. But behind the voice was someone deeply entangled in heroin addiction. Friends say McCready hoped Mad Season could be more than a band. He hoped it might be a lifeline. The four rehearsed in Seattle. They were loose sessions at first, jam-driven, letting the music take whatever shape it wanted. Those early practices were less about precision and more about creating a safe space. No judgment, no pressure, just sound. When they decided to record, they chose Bad Animals Studio, the facility co-owned by Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart. That's where Above was born, a record that didn't sound like anyone chasing radio or MTV, but like four men trying to carve a path through the darkness. When it came time for lyrics, Layne didn't reach for cliches. He reached for a book. On his lap was The Prophet, a 1923 collection of spiritual essays by Lebanese-American writer Khalil Gibran. Gibran's words had been circulating for decades. Poetic, mystical, part philosophy, part prayer. The book was a favorite in counterculture circles, passed around by seekers looking for something deeper than religion, but more accessible than theology. Layne clung to it. Bandmates remembered him carrying paperbacks, scribbling notes in margins, sometimes quoting passages between takes. To them, it was clear he wasn't just writing songs. He was trying to use music as a spiritual practice. One line in particular stayed with him. In the essay On Pain, Gibran writes, "Much of your pain is self-chosen." When Layne sang, "My pain is self-chosen, at least so the prophet says," he wasn't being metaphorical. He was paraphrasing directly. Barrett Martin later said, "Layne felt as though he was on a spiritual mission through his music. That mission wasn't about selling millions or being adored. It was about turning private suffering into a public map. Songs that admitted the truth without glamorizing it." The metaphor of the river was Gibran's influence, too. To Layne, life with addiction was like stepping into a calm current that suddenly drags you under. From the shore, it looks peaceful. From within, it's unstoppable. By early 1995, Mad Season had a finished record, Above. It wasn't flashy. It was heavy without being metal, bluesy without being retro, spacious without being minimalist. It sounded like something poured out of the soil itself. On March 14, 1995, the album dropped. Less than 2 weeks later, on March 27th, River of Deceit became the lead single. Critics didn't know what to make of it. At a time when radio was dominated by grunge anthems, post-grunge aggression, and slick alternative hits, here was a song that was quiet, deliberate, almost hymn-like, and yet it hit. Within weeks, the single climbed to number 2 on Billboard's mainstream rock chart and number 9 on the modern rock chart. It became the band's defining track. For McCready, Martin, and Saunders, it was proof that audiences were ready for something more contemplative. For Layne, it was proof that honesty could resonate louder than noise. The music video, directed by Josh Taft, the same director behind Pearl Jam's early classics, Alive, Even Flow, and Oceans, matched the mood. Shot in black and white, it didn't glamorize. It lingered on faces, eyes, silhouettes. Layne looked both fragile and fierce, a man singing truths that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Fans clung to the opening line about the prophet, but the rest of the song carried its own weight. I could either burn or cut off my pride and buy some time. A head full of lies is the weight, tied to my waist. Over and over, the lyrics point to ownership. Not excuses, not blame, ownership. My pain. That insistence is part of what made the song so devastating. It wasn't about the pressures of fame or the music industry, or even the Seattle scene. It was about an individual confronting his own choices and the consequences of those choices. Other verses highlight temptation and consequence, the idea of trading pride for survival, or realizing that lies we tell ourselves eventually become anchors. For anyone struggling with any addiction, whether substances, self-doubt, or destructive cycles, the song became a mirror. It was brutal but strangely comforting, because it told the truth everyone else tried to avoid. And yet, it was never only about Layne. Listeners who had never touched heroin still found themselves in the song. The river could be anything: alcohol, depression, toxic love, the cycles we know are killing us, but we can't pull free from. That universality is why the song continues to resonate. Mad Season took Above on the road briefly. Their live shows became legends, not because of chaos, but because of vulnerability. Staley would sometimes sit on a stool, barely moving, but when the first note of River of Deceit left his mouth, rooms went silent. Fans didn't scream, they listened. In an era defined by distortion and volume, that quiet was louder than anything. Seattle in the 1990s wasn't just a hotbed of music, it was a hotbed of drugs. Heroin flooded the Pacific Northwest. By the mid-90s, purity had gone up, prices had gone down, and overdose deaths were climbing. In King County alone, opioid deaths more than doubled between 1990 and 1999, peaking near the decade's end. Ambulances were frequent outside clubs, and musicians often swapped stories of who hadn't shown up to rehearsal because they were strung out, or worse. Bands were caught in the middle. On stage, they were icons. Off stage, they were just people navigating a storm. Layne Staley, Kurt Cobain, Andrew Wood before them, all fell victim to the same current. For every band that made it, there were dozens that didn't. Silenced not by critics, but by overdoses. For a time, Mad Season felt like a sanctuary, but it didn't last. On January 15, 1999, John Baker Saunders died of a heroin overdose in Los Angeles. It was the first major blow and effectively the end of Mad Season. 3 years later, on April 5, 2002, Layne Staley died alone in his Seattle condo from an accidental speedball overdose, a mix of heroin and cocaine. His body wasn't discovered until April 19th, after friends and family raised alarms. He was 34. Some fans later tried to cast River of Deceit as prophecy, a man predicting his own downfall. But that misses the point. The song wasn't fortune-telling. It was a report from the battlefield, written in real time. And yet, the battlefield report became scripture for some. River of Deceit became the track fans turned to, not only when thinking about Layne, but when reflecting on their own private struggles Online forums, tribute shows, and even addiction support groups often cite the song as a touchstone. It has become part of the language people use to talk about the invisible fight. River of Deceit could have faded into a footnote. Mad Season released only one studio album. They toured briefly, then fell apart. By traditional industry standards, they should have been forgotten. But the song refused to die. It became something more than a single. Survivors kept playing it, and new generations kept discovering it. On January 30th, 2015, the surviving members of Mad Season reunited at Benaroya Hall in Seattle. Backed by the Seattle Symphony, they brought Chris Cornell on stage to sing River of Deceit. Hearing Cornell, another voice of the 90s, another man who carried his own shadows, sing those words turned the song into something communal. Cornell's voice cracked at points, raw and unvarnished, as if channeling not just Layne's pain, but his own. The orchestra swelled behind him, strings and brass making the song feel almost liturgical. Fans wept openly, clutching candles or holding up old ticket stubs like relics. Musicians on stage looked shaken. It wasn't nostalgia, it was prayer. For one night, Seattle wasn't just mourning what it had lost, it was testifying to what still remained. Today, you'll still find the song in playlists, tributes, covers, not because it was a chart hit, but because it speaks to something timeless, the fight to stay afloat when the river pulls. River of Deceit isn't prophecy. It's accountability. It refuses the myth that addiction just happens to people, like lightning strikes. It says, choices were made, and then the current became too strong to fight alone. That's why it endures. Not because it predicted the end, but because it gives language to the fight before the end. The fragile, desperate space where help can still get in. And that's the haunting gift of Layne Staley's voice. Even at his weakest, even at his most broken, he found words that told the truth. No excuses, no romanticizing, just truth. So when you hear that opening line, "My pain is self-chosen, at least so the prophet says," remember, it wasn't just a lyric, it was Layne holding up a mirror. For himself, for his friends, for anyone willing to admit that their river too might be deeper and darker than it looks.